After On the Jewish Question, Marx no longer talks about political emancipation versus human emancipation. That's a distinction, terminology that's specific to On the Jewish Question. But the basic idea that we find in On the Jewish Question, with this difference between political and human emancipation, that theme, that basic idea runs throughout Marx's writings. And the theme or idea is something like this. What we find in Marx is an analysis, or what we often find in Marx is analysis and criticism of currently existing social structures, of the way society works today, and in particular, the way the economy works now, here in the, in the United States, in a politically emancipated state, whatever you want to call it. We find analysis and criticism, what Marx is going to come to call later on, of capitalism, of a capitalistic society. He also then kind of points forward, gestures toward a better society, how things might look if the problems were to be solved, if we advanced beyond a merely politically emancipated state, or the way things are now, or capitalistic society, whatever you want to call it. And we find that, and what we found in On the Jewish Question was that his vision for how things could be better, this human emancipation, involved this strange term, species being. And so what we're going to do going forward is we're going to pay more attention to, we're going to go into greater detail, I should say, concerning Marx's criticism of what he will later call capitalistic society. And we're going to see that here in the Economic and Philosophic Manuscripts in his discussion of alienation. That's primarily critical of the way things work now for us in our society. But one of the things that we also see in the Economic and Philosophic Manuscripts in his discussion of alienation is a little bit more information as to what exactly this species being thing is. What is species being? What does he mean by that? He gives us more information here in the Economic and Philosophic Manuscripts of 1844. Now, the idea is something like this. So this concept of alienation, this is one of the more influential and popular concepts that people have drawn out of Marx or turned to Marx for, this idea that workers are alienated from their work in a capitalistic society, that workers experience alienation or estrangement. This idea has been hugely kind of popular and influential. And so we're going to see what it amounts to. We see what exactly it means, what exactly Marx is saying. So the idea is what Marx is focusing in on is workers in a capitalistic or politically emancipated state. Workers as they work in civil society, to put it in the terms of On the Jewish Question. And what Marx wants to say is that such workers experience alienation in 4 different senses. And I'm going to put all of them up there, and we're going to run through them, describing what exactly Marx is getting at, what exactly he means. It will be helpful to have some idea of kind of what he has in mind, though, by the worker and working in a capitalistic society. What seems to be at the forefront of his mind in a lot of his discussions of the of work is factory work, and in particular, work on an assembly line. So if you imagine a car plant where you have workers lined up on an assembly line, and there's like a conveyor belt or something, and a piece conveys toward, and then they hit a thing, and that it goes away, and another piece comes, right? That's how work works in a capitalistic society, right? So you have a worker, the worker's hired into a factory, and he's given a very specific rote task. He is assigned, in this case, right, to screw that screw in. That part, whatever it is, that piece of a car. I have no idea what that thing is, even though I drew it. He sees the same one. It comes down the line. It doesn't have that screw screwed in. His job is to screw it in. And he sits there or stands there 8 hours a day doing that. It's unskilled labor. Yeah. It's kind of menial labor. All you do is that over and over and over. That's the kind of work that is characteristic of capitalistic societies, according to Marx. And so when he's talking about workers being alienated, he's talking about this kind of guy, this worker, a worker like this, the worker at the assembly line, the factory worker, whatever. All right. So Marx's idea, the first idea he has, the first sense in which they're alienated, the worker is alienated from the object of the worker's labor. So the object of the worker's labor would be this thing that he's helping to make. Let's say that's some sort of car part. I don't know what car part that would be. Let's say that's some sort of car part. And so that worker is working on a car. The object of the worker's labor is the car, right? Marx is saying that worker is alienated from the car. The car to the worker is seen as something foreign, as something not really related to me. Well, why not? Well, because the worker makes the car and then the car just goes and gets sold. The worker has no claim over the car. It's not like it's the worker's car, right? The worker is given a wage. In exchange for that wage, the worker supplies the labor. The worker screws the screw into the thing. The worker is given the wage for doing a very specific task. The worker doesn't have any say over that task. The worker doesn't get to decide how the car is made or what the design of it should be. The worker invests none of his or her own creativity or personality into the object being made. Right? And so when that object rolls off the assembly line, the worker doesn't see himself in the car. The worker didn't have any say, any creative control over how the thing was made. And so when the car rolls off the assembly line, it strikes the worker as something completely foreign to the worker, right? That's not me. I don't see myself in that because I didn't put any of myself into it. All I did was screw this thing down. And so that object doesn't seem to bear really any relation to me, the worker. That's Marx's idea. The worker is alienated from that object, right? The worker doesn't see him or herself in the object at all, even though the worker worked on it. Second way in which the worker is alienated, the worker is alienated from his or her own laboring, his or her own productive activity. The actual turning of the screwdriver and screwing the thing in, the worker is alienated from that. Why? Well, because it's seen as a burden. It's seen as a chore. The worker would not do this unless they got a wage for it. And the one way Marx puts it, the worker's not at home when the worker is laboring. And you're only at home, so to say, at home in a kind of metaphor, you're at ease, comfortable, when you're not working. Working is a chore, right? This is how it works, not just for factory workers, but for anybody in a capitalistic society, any worker, right? You're not comfortable. You're not at home when you're working. It's a chore that you have to go do, right? That work that you have to do is a chore, and you only do it for the wage. Another way that Marx describes this is that the worker's laboring is forced labor. It's forced. labor. Now, he doesn't mean that the worker is literally enslaved and forced to work. That's not how it works, right? The worker agrees to come in and gets paid for the work. And so Marx means something different when he says that it's forced labor. What he means is that the work is only done as a necessary means to the end of survival. The worker needs to eat. The worker needs a roof over his or her head. And in order to have that roof over your head, in order to have food to eat and clothes to wear and so on, you need money. And so the worker sells his or her laboring for money, right? That's the idea. And so it's forced labor in the sense that they'd rather not do it, but they have to. They are forced to in order to survive. Right? That's Marx's idea. And that's why they do it. They do it just to survive. That's it, right? Kind of way to sum this up, this being alienated from your own laboring. What Marx says is this would be the idea. Here's a sign that you're alienated from your laboring. If you won the lottery, won $1 billion in the lottery, or say that worker won $1 billion in the lottery, do you think he'd show up to work the next day? No, of course not, right? If all of his needs were taken care of, he'd stop working right away, right? Let's say he gets the lottery ticket, whatever, on his lunch break and goes back to the plant, and there they read the lottery and he wins, right? Tell off your boss, walk off in a big show, you're out of there. You're not staying, right? You'd rather not perform this laboring. That's a sign that you're alienated from it. You'd rather not do it. You only do it because you're kind of forced to. That's how it works in a capitalistic society, right? So workers are alienated from the object of his or her labor because you can't see your personality in it. Right? You're given a task and you don't get any say how that works, right? You don't get any creative control. You just do it, and so you do it. And workers are alienated from their very laboring. It's seen as a chore, as a burden. They only do it for the money out of need. Yeah. Third one, we get our favorite term back now. The worker is alienated from his or her species being. Now, Marx's discussion here, when he discusses this third sense of alienation, is very helpful for understanding what exactly he's getting at with species being. Because what he goes on to talk about, what he goes on to say, is that the species being of a species is what it does. It's its life activity. The life of the species is its activity. It's what it does. It's what the thing in question does. Right? And so he's thinking in somewhat biological terms. He's thinking of like other species, and now you have the human species, right? The life of a species is its activity. And what he notes about human beings, and it's not just human beings that are like this, other creatures do this too, other animals, but human beings engage in productive activity. The life activity of human beings is what Marx calls kind of conscious. So aware, you're aware of what you're doing, right? Conscious, productive activity. That's like so in a species being, what's he getting at here? Something like human nature. He never calls it that, but that's something like the idea. When he talks about our species being, what he really has in mind is something like human nature. And so a human emancipation consists in realizing our human nature, according to Marx, right? And on the Jewish question. And here, when we say that the worker is alienated from his or her species being, what he's saying is that the worker is alienated from their human nature. Why? Because their human nature consists in conscious, productive activity, production, making stuff, taking in the materials, the raw materials of nature, and reconfiguring them. That's what human beings do. That's how human beings live their lives, right? That's the nature of human beings. But what's happened in a capitalistic society is that we've made laboring, we've made productive activity alien to us. And so, insofar as that second sense of alienation is true, insofar as the worker is alienated from his or her own laboring, well, then the third sense follows as well. If you're alienated from your own laboring, you're going to be alienated from your species being, because the species being of the human species is conscious, productive, social, Marx will add later, activity, productive activity, conscious, social, free, productive activity. That's our nature. That's our species being. And so, insofar as our productive activity is alien to us and we're alienated from it, we're also alienated from our human nature. That's what Marx thinks. That's what he claims here, right? And so the middle two kind of go together. The third sense of alienation follows from the second sense of alienation. Lastly, and most briefly, Marx doesn't really discuss this at all. We'll have occasion later, perhaps, to return to this point and discuss it in a little bit more detail. But Marx claims that the worker is alienated from other human beings. And the worker is alienated from other human beings precisely because the worker is alienated from his human nature, his own human nature, from his species being. That's about as much as Marx says. We'll put more on that as we proceed. But for our purposes, what are really important are those first three senses of alienation. That really kind of gives us the sense of what Marx means when he's talking about alienation in a kind of modern capitalistic economy. And so I think Marx would want to say this is all true, not just for the factory worker or whatever, but this is true of workers in general. And maybe not every last worker, but workers in general across a capitalistic system, across a place like the United States. Workers are going to be alienated from their labor. And this is really bad, according to Marx, because this is what's inimical to true human emancipation. It's inimical to our realizing our human nature, right? And so going forward, one of the things that we're going to look at is what the alternative might be, what non-alienated labor might look at. We'll return to that later.